Alors, je présente sans plus tarder Mme Gail Lord.
Bonjour et merci beaucoup André, merci beaucoup Lina, merci beaucoup à tout le monde ici. C'est merveilleux d'être ici, à la très belle ville de Québec. J'ai décidé avec Lina que parler en français pour moi serait prendre trop de temps. Mais parler en anglais, j'ai l'habitude d'être trop vite. Alors, j'espère d'être dans le milieu of all that. So the topic is, this is the hard part. There. Yes, that's what we see. Good. Is to really focus on Quebec City as an international cultural destination. And, you know, I was saying to Andre that you do everything so right here that you've had a fantastic decade. You've topped all the charts. You've tremendous recognition. But I know Quebec wants to go farther. So my challenge was to, just to prepare this talk, to analyze the data, that we were given, you know, to the best that we could, and to maybe I'm going to show you some other comparator cities as well, and try and draw some lessons that will perhaps help you in your strategic plan. So that's the goal. So first question, am I talking too fast? No. Oh my God, fantastic. Because if I am, all you have to do is go like that. And then I'll try and slow down. Okay. Good. So you already heard about my company, of which I'm very proud. These are where our offices are. And, well, we've been lucky, and we're even so lucky that we're doing some projects in Quebec. It's not surprising to do projects in China, but for a company in Toronto, it's very wonderful to do projects in Quebec, and I'd be happy to talk about that separately. Worldwide, we still have a lot to go, but the little blue dots kind of give you an idea of the experience that I bring to the subject. I haven't been in all these places, but we do try and share our knowledge inside the company. And most important, we share our knowledge outside the company. So pretty much everything we know, we've published. And there are 3 or 4 new books here. The newest one is a book on digital planning. We'll talk a little bit about some digital aspects of the international destination issue, and also one on soft power, which I think has some relevance for your strategic plan, and then a very fascinating book by my late husband, Gail Lord, on art and energy, which is a whole world unto itself. So firstly, what is a destination? We habitually think about a city or a town or a wonderful building, but a destination is something, again, different. And I think for our conversation, for strategic plan, the most important thing is to understand deeply that a destination is more than the sum of the city's attractions. And there's a great tendency in marketing a city, and maybe how many of you are from a cultural institution, like a museum or theater maybe? Okay, and how many from tourism industry, like hotel and, right, okay. So I think the one thing you share in common, and the rest are maybe some people, students maybe from the university. Oh, well, okay. So in general, we have the industry here. We have the attraction, for-profit attraction sector maybe. No, okay. So I think that even the hotel sector and the cultural sector have something in common. You love your hotel most likely, and you love your museum or your theater most likely. So the tendency always is to promote those things. And maybe you promote your neighbor, and the city kind of then has to be the big compromiser. I'm sure Andre is very good at this, and has to sort of promote everybody. But promoting everybody doesn't create a destination. And the destination comes from placemaking. It comes from, above all, something I'm going to talk quite a bit about, which is creating a meta-narrative. Get away from the list of attractions and try and create a storyline, a meta-narrative, and I'm going to define that in a way that takes the city from its past, its present, and its future, and above all, is communicating relevance. And the interesting question is relevance to whom? Well, relevance to the people you hope to engage. And so that's a bit of a deep thing that we're going to get into. Now, why do I keep coming back to this idea of soft power? And the reason is that soft power is, well, I think how many people have heard this term? I don't think it has a French equivalent. You sort of, yeah. I've given the talk before in other countries, and it's a kind of a big term in English language, but it doesn't seem to translate. So soft power is the term that a Harvard professor, so it must be right, gave to what we used to just call cultural diplomacy, right? But cultural diplomacy mainly means giving gifts. Important people meet, they give each other gifts, and they make peace for a little while, then they make war, then they meet again. And it's a limited idea, whereas soft power is actually about exercising influence, hopefully in a long-term trajectory, without military or economic force, all right? So, well, a boycott is hard power, right? Obviously, a war is hard power, but a lot can be obtained. And soft power is not always good. I mean, soft power can also be propaganda. Propaganda is a form of soft power. So, but the fact is that in the world up until very recently, what's happening now is perhaps another story, soft power has been a very important way of kind of preserving the more or less peaceful way that things have been going. Now, a soft power destination, and I think it's so interesting for Quebec City, because here we are on the Plains of Abraham, on the site of one of the most decisive exercises of hard power in the history of North America. And I suppose you could also say, given the importance economically of North America, you could say maybe one of the most decisive hard power events in world history, one of maybe, I don't know, top 500, something like that. We're on this site, but now this is very much a site of soft power. Why? Because we have the influence of this museum complex, you have the cultural activities and the festivals that take place here, you have skating and cross-country skiing and sporting activities. So I can't think of this place, which is so important, without thinking of how it's transforming a site of hard power to one of soft power. Now, why are people attracted to soft power destinations, right? Because you might just say, well, it's a historic site, and that's about all there is to it. It becomes a destination when it is a place of excellence, right? Relevance or pertinence, sustainability, and legitimacy. And these factors underlie more and more popular international cultural destinations. And that's related maybe to another issue, which is people's hunger for meaning. And at the base of everything that we talk about, and that's the only time I'm going to use the M word, is the tremendous hunger people in our society today have for meaning. And that, I think, underlies all our work. So international destination cities typically have these things in common. They're going to excel in gastronomy. They'll have multiple neighborhoods. It's not just one place. There'll be a certain diversity. Retail, but authentic retail. In other words, a shopping mall with the usual brand suspects is not really a destination in this sense. Authentic retail makes an international destination city. Concerts, festivals, I think you can read faster than I can speak. But again, the creative economy, including craft, exhibitions, galleries, and museums. And now, increasingly, that we've entered the possibility of working 24 hours a day, is workspaces and meeting spaces, because really increasingly there is this thing now called creative tourism, where people actually want to participate in the creative work of a place. And I would say Quebec would probably be an excellent location for that. Now, I have to pay an homage to Quebec City. You have been really justly reaping rewards. I've just listed for 2016, and I'm sure there are more, and I'm sure you all know this, but very important Canadian and U.S. awards. And this past year, you've also won some international awards. These are the ones that we could find, and maybe there may very well be some others. What's interesting is you want to, in order to be more of an international destination, you want to win even more international awards. U.S. is a big market for you, and of course that is not our country, so that is also international. So anyway, we have to, maybe if we put the U.S. ones on the right-hand column, we would see more of those awards. And you've been a decade on the world's best cities lists, which is pretty fantastic. But of course, you want to stay there, and you want to do better and do more. And so, you don't have the view of resting on your laurels. It's interesting to me that when we looked at the citations, the friendly locals who don't make fun of you when you speak French badly, and who are kind and helpful, is actually very, very near the top of all the criteria. So all the work that you put into that pays off. Now, you know the funny story about when they tried to do training for friendly locals in Paris. How many know what happened? You know, they did a training blitz and tried to get, people in the various service industries to be more friendly. And then they did a survey afterwards to find out what the tourists thought. They didn't think at all what is reflected in these comments. The feedback that they got was that they didn't feel like they were in Paris because people were nice to them instead of being nasty. So, but in Quebec, it seems to definitely be a winning formula, and for that, I congratulate you very, very, very much. Now, you were awarded an interesting award in 2016, which is as a leading cultural destination city. And if you look at the comments of the jury, I think that and you were selected over Los Angeles and Lyon. Los Angeles is so big, it's not one of the comparator cities I'm going to show you, but Lyon is, and we'll look at Lyon, is that bold cultural initiatives like where we are now was definitely a factor. And so, again, I guess you could say it's, in a way, maybe the Bilbao effect in a sense, that major cultural initiatives, boldness, and then the follow-through is very important to attracting international status. Now, a few definitions, just because I'm going to use these words, and sometimes it's good to have a definition. Authenticity, everyone knows what that is, and this is where Quebec excels beyond excels. And I guess what I would say is that in all the talk we are now hearing, particularly south of us in the United States, is some people feel left out by globalization. And I guess the danger always in any form of internationalization is loss of authenticity. And I know that that's such a struggle constantly of Quebec and of Quebec people that you could probably give lessons on that. And that's something actually to consider. That's something to consider, that's an expertise area that Quebec has that the rest of the world badly needs. So I just want to plant these thoughts. That would be a point of relevance. That would be a point of connection with many people. Okay, another definition is placemaking. Placemaking isn't the same as putting up a monument somewhere. It's actually a collaborative, community-based process where the public realm is actually shaped in order to maximize shared value. And probably if this were a 6-hour perish the thought session, we could have, maybe in the discussion period, you'd like to talk about areas of the city which are really very meaningful places because of what happened and maybe what will happen there. And so placemaking is rather key. And then this is this term that I used already once, this idea of a meta-narrative. So I think we all listen to music, and in music there's always themes. Meta-narrative is what connects the themes, right? And increasingly, I think you need to go, to be really successful, you go beyond branding, beyond logo, beyond slogan, to say, what is the meta-narrative of our city? What is our story? And that's not something that I'm going to even guess at, because that's a task, I think, for your strategic plan, or maybe if you agree with this idea, your strategic plan would say, well, we will develop a meta-narrative, and we're going to assemble people and communities to do that together. So I just wanted to show you that I did a little, you have authentic events in Quebec City. I'm not going to read them out. You have unique attractions, both natural attractions, built museum attractions. You have these fantastic things. The Old City itself, of course, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's a stellar experience that brings people back and back and back. And the Winter Carnival, winter is a hard time, and the Winter Carnival has obviously been been transformative. Gastronomy is strong here, and that's again a real positive and part of your success. I happen to absolutely love this project, and I was so impressed by it. I know it's over the Image Mill, but what a fantastic initiative for the 400th anniversary. And I guess what I think, I had this other idea, which is that every town and city in Canada has silos, because that was our big industry. And wouldn't it be great if, and it's too late for the 150th, but maybe we'd do it for the 151st year or some other anniversary, but wouldn't it be great to have Robert Lepage working with young artists in cities all across the country and with the NFB to do this, and maybe even in other countries that have grain silos. I don't think we're the only ones. Well, we're the most prominent, and we have the best and the biggest grain silos. We all know that. But, who to do that. I just thought this was utterly fantastic. So as far as events go, and again, this is, of course, the La Caserne. And I guess why I'm showing this picture is just to say that it's not only about great events that a city gets on the international stage, but it's also about places of creativity. And in Robert Lepage, and probably in other artists, you have enormous resources of places where things are created. And probably moving along into this next century, that is going to be one of Quebec's most important assets. Maybe places of creativity is actually part of that meta-narrative, rather than we have a beautiful old intact city, we were defeated, now we're reborn. I mean, whatever that story is right now, maybe places of creativity is actually part of the meta-narrative. I leave that's obviously, your decision and not mine. And along that line, the Biennale has been a big success story in bringing significant curators here, in linking local or Quebec artists and Canadian artists to international artists. It's definitely doing its job. One of the things that we noticed in looking at the media on the Biennale is that the press was mainly Canadian. So one of the challenges, I think, is how to make this Biennale better known and more of an international attraction. And I think you have a couple of challenges there. I've just mentioned them now since we've got the slide and you're probably looking at it. One is that one of your biggest international markets is the United States. And biennials are almost unknown in the United States, except for the Whitney Biennial in New York City, which is on right now, and Site Santa Fe, and then there's one in New Orleans. So the concept biennial is actually not very well known in your major market. It's not even well known in Toronto, for our shame. There are many things to be ashamed about coming from Toronto, actually. And to me, that's one of them. So how to link this important biennial that's 7 or 8 years old now into the kind of international network, I think there's something like 162 biennials in the world, is an interesting challenge. And I'd say that's about... and I think it's partly institutional because you have a wonderful biennial organization, but it's also something for the tourism strategic plan. In other words, to have this, to move the needle, as it were, the indicator on international cultural tourism, it would require having a firmer linkage between your biennial and some of the other ones, because but it just doesn't seem to be there yet. Having said that, 7 years is actually quite young. Now, why do I emphasize this aspect of cultural tourism and international cultural tourism? So I'm about to tell you that. First of all, what is a cultural tourist? This is what they are, right? They're people like most people sitting in this room. It's a cultural tourist is a person who goes to a place either in whole or in part to experience culture. Now, according to the data that we got from your tourism group, you're actually counting cultural tourists as people who attend one cultural event. So it's a fairly restrictive definition. I would suggest a bit more research to maybe refine that definition, but it certainly works for now. Now, we care about cultural tourists for four main reasons. Partly because we're cultural tourists, so we like them, and everybody likes people who are just like themselves. But we have to set that aside and think about four objective reasons why we like cultural tourists. Cultural tourists stay longer. When they make a visit, they stay longer than shopping tourists or business visitors or any other kind of visitor. Sports, they stay longer. They spend more money. Now, they may spend more money because they have more money, but there's actual evidence that the young cultural tourist who's a backpacker doesn't spend money on hotels because they camp out or they stay at Airbnb or whatever, but they actually will want to spend more money on food experiences and on artisanal stuff and so on. Cultural tourists are more likely to be international. I'll show you the data and you'll see that. And maybe the most, I think, nice thing about cultural tourists is they tend to be more respectful of the environment and of other cultures and other people. So, the typical British lager loud, or, the British tourist in Spain who, you go to Spain and you see restaurant after restaurant basically offering very bad British food. That is coming from a mass tourism base that's not cultural, that's not respectful of the local culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So cultural tourists are very desirable. I would just put in a little side note, which is that my company did the very first study in history on cultural tourism. It was in 1992, and at that time, the World Tourism WTO, World Tourism Organization, did not have a category called cultural tourism. Did not exist. So this definition came from our work and so on. So I thought it would be good to look at some comparator cities that are successful in attracting tourists and are successful in attracting international cultural tourists. Okay? So everybody collects data in different ways. And this was not a research project. It was just, let's do some research so I can give a decent talk and that people will have some stimulation. And maybe it will give you ideas about further research that you would like to do and to be involved in doing here in Quebec. So this is just, these are, now you'll say, why did you choose these cities? Well, these are the tourism data, the number of tourists who visit these cities. And I chose cities that are kind of small to mid-sized cities. Population-wise, this is the tourism. Actually, I should help you a bit more. These are the cities. You see, there they are. That's the population base. And again, they all count population differently. You know, Americans count their cities one way, so we count them another way. Europeans count them another way. But to the best of our ability, we use tables that were reasonable. And I've been to a lot of these cities, and maybe you have, and you would know this is basically the city itself. So Quebec City, it's right in there. 500 and let's just round it to 520,000 people. And look at that. You're just a little smaller than Dublin. You're a lot bigger than Bilbao. You're bigger than New Orleans. Of course, New Orleans, that's the problem with American cities, right? It's just the center of the city. All the rich suburbs are not counted in this 378,000, but it's a city. Boston, same story, 645,000. Glasgow, not as big as you might have guessed. Reykjavik is there for a reason, and of course it's tiny. Lyon is actually smaller than Quebec City, and it's an interesting comparator for a number of reasons. And Geneva is substantially smaller, and it's interesting too for other reasons. So all these cities have different reasons, but they're all quite successful in getting much larger numbers of tourists than they have in their population, and that's very typical. And we're going to look at each one. And as we go through them, I'm going to kind of share my observation of where I think Quebec is maybe stronger in some cases and where that city is maybe stronger. I hope that's helpful. I think it's better to be concrete than just to look at a bunch of words. So here we are with our tourism numbers. Now, Boston, astonishing at 17 million. Even if it was 10 million, it'd still be pretty astonishing. New Orleans is astonishing. So just I would comment on that is that, well, I'm not going to comment now. Try and remember the number. You'll see the numbers when we get into the cities. Why don't I do it that way? I'm quite fascinated by this, but I have to move along. Okay. Now, here's the story of Quebec City. You are getting about 4.3 million tourists, which is a very good number. Glasgow's strategic tourism plan said that they would get 4 million tourists by this year, 2016, and you know what? They only got 2 million. So you need to just realize this is a big achievement, okay? Now, according to the way data is collected here, 1.7 million are cultural tourists, and year-over-year increase in tourists to Quebec City is around 6.8%. Now, what's interesting is that when you control, and I hope, Andre, I'm not really butchering the data that you sent us, but it is what it is at this point, so you'll tell me afterwards, is that if you look at your overseas tourists, 91% of them attend a cultural event. If you look at your U.S. tourists, almost 93% of them attend a cultural event or fall into your definition of cultural tourists. But look at the Canadians. And the Canadians, of course, comprise, I think there isn't a Quebecois who doesn't come to Quebec City. They includes a huge number of Quebecois, and maybe they come for a lot of different reasons, and they don't necessarily participate in a designated cultural activity. So that's this connection. And by the way, that would be true of every single place. That is not unique to Quebec. What is unique to Quebec is that everyone who lives in Quebec wants to come to Quebec City. That's very special. It is not true that everyone who lives in Ontario wants to come to Toronto, let alone everybody who wants to come to Quebec. They don't want to come to Toronto, I'm sure. But people from Toronto want to come to Quebec City. So, you know, you've really established a very good image in that sense. So this is another way of looking at the data, and this is 2014, it's all 2014 data, which is fairly current. But of all the tourists, just take a look at the, Quebec is just very, very important. Overseas, USA, together is 22%. So that's a number that I'd like you to remember, how many foreign tourists there are. We won't count rest of Canada as foreign. The cultural tourist, you see again that what we've already seen, which is that the overseas and USA are highly involved in cultural tourism. Now, this Quebec 38% does not seem to make that much sense to me, so it's a problem. Andre, you have to help me with that. That's a number that seems not quite right. So what attractions are current cultural tourists engaging with? And you can see here that the historic sites are high, and museums and galleries follow. Festivals or fairs. Of course, museums and galleries and historic sites they're around year-round, whereas festivals and fairs and events are not. And plays and concerts are not, and they require pre-planning. And again, those numbers are fairly typical. But it does demonstrate, by the way, the importance of museums, galleries, and historic sites. So, you have to recognize that. And behavior based on origin, again, this was a special compiling that Quebec did with Statistics Canada. You can see from 0 to 100% that for Americans, historic sites, very, very big. For the overseas, art gallery and museums, somewhat bigger. And again, Quebec, historic site, and festivals and fairs are lower, but still the American visitors are quite interested in those as well. Okay, so see that. Now, here is where this average expenditure per visitor is really important. So it says, why do we care about these people so much? An average Quebecer is, I'm not going to read, you can see the difference, and the little circles show you the difference of spending. And of course, from a point of view of an economist, the fact that Quebecers and Canadians spend money that they would have spent at home here is not hugely significant. I realize it's significant for people here in Quebec City, but from an economist's point of view, the money that's coming from overseas in the United States is like export, right? It's bringing money from other countries here. So it's equivalent to if you were selling a commodity in those countries. It's bringing new money into the province and into the country. So that is actually why these numbers matter, and why what you do matters so much, because it is a very, very significant industry. And likewise, these are the durations in time as well. And again, the people coming from a greater distance, they're not going to not come because there's a storm, right? They're not going to, because they've pre-planned their travel, and so they're also a more, stable visitor base from that point of view. Now, modes of transport I'm just going to touch on, but air is very important for the cultural tourist. For this well-heeled person that's going to spend more money, is coming from a greater distance. Obviously, you can drive from New York State, you can drive from Boston. That's clear, but it does say that going into the future, it will be very important. Your airport, your airline deals, if you like, and relationships, and your airport is actually very, very important for this market segment. Okay, so learning from some of those bubbles that we looked at before, these are the things that I have taken away from looking at it, and I would just, and I'm going to come back to them at the end. So the first point is the cultural destinations are clusters of things. It's not one thing, and that's very, very important. The more you can cluster and then have a narrative or a storyline around a group of things. It could be a park and shopping and a museum, a historic site and a park, obviously here we are, and a beautiful view and an event. The more things are clustered, the more likely they are to be a destination. Second point is a meta-narrative that involves relevance and soft power, elevates what you're doing beyond, because it's unique. Your story is your story, right? There are other old cities in the world, right? Not in North America, and I shouldn't use the word old, UNESCO historic, world cities, but your narrative, your meta-narrative is your meta-narrative. And if you find that right one, if you create that right one, it can be enormously influential and can put you on the world map in a very elevated way. Authenticity, language, and accent. You'll see that all these cities have language uniqueness or accent. I mean, the Boston accent is practically like another language. Artisanal craft is another aspect, gastronomy, of course, and neighborhoods. It's really neighborhoods in two senses. One is people want to see how other people live, and so that's very nice. There's a big push in many cities to get Chicago, where we did the cultural plan, get people into these extremely dangerous neighborhoods, I may say, where hundreds of people get shot on a weekend, but nonetheless, try and get people visiting the neighborhoods and feeling the authenticity of the neighborhoods. But in another sense, too, it's not enough, I think, to have great historic neighborhoods. And I'll talk about this with respect to a few of our comparative cities. Many cities are saying, okay, here is where we have our major institutions, but here's our creative center in another location where we have our contemporary culture, our creative industries. And the importance there is if you have more than one area to visit, and that would be true of Quebec City, that's a reason to stay an extra day. And a great example, I don't know how many people have been to Santa Fe, but Santa Fe has the old historic city, and it's very, very old indeed. But they're opening up a whole new area and in the rail yard district, which is where Site Santa Fe, which is a biennial, which you might want to be connected to, and the State Art Museum has its contemporary collection there. So they've opened up a whole other area. It's within walking distance, but still a completely different neighborhood, and it becomes a reason to stay one extra day, but only for the cultural tourists, not for the others. International festival circuit, very important. Diasporic community, I'm going to talk about that. The UNESCO Creative Cities Network, and then transportation. So let's talk a little bit about Bilbao. Everyone has heard. Has anybody here actually been to Bilbao? Oh, everybody. So you all know the story. You can see that this number of almost 900,000 visitors has held for 15 years. And the number of international visitors corresponds precisely to the number of people who visit the Guggenheim. So Bilbao has its own, it's a province, like Quebec, and it does have a very fine art museum, but it never attracted any tourists. It was so again, that was a challenge. And these are the challenges that you have in Bilbao: separatism, actually terrorism, which is a problem. So understanding that Bilbao is not beloved of the rest of Spain, right? And so people from around don't actually go to Bilbao. So their tourism is coming by plane from London or from other cities, from New York. Recently, after 15 years, they're now starting to get people from Madrid, and but they still, while there's a fast train system that links most Spanish cities, it does not include Bilbao. So that's been a challenge for them. That's where location comes in, and of course their very special Basque language is a challenge. So that's what the museum looks like, and you just see. So there's strengths: regeneration and rebranding the city, the Guggenheim, unique Basque culture, language, and fantastic food. It is a member of the UNESCO Creative City Network. Now, I'm going to show you a map of this network, and they joined under design. And many of you will know that Montreal is, I think, the only Canadian city that's part of the UNESCO. There may be one other, I'm not sure, Creative City Network, and it's also chosen design as its main thing. Cluster of great architecture that they built, not just the Guggenheim, but other very, very fine architecture. And as a city, they've tried to mitigate their isolation by clustering with San Sebastian, which has a major film festival, which has a somewhat different tradition, even though it's still part of the Basque country. So Quebec, of course, with your 4 million tourists, that's a lot more than 887,000. So you have to see that you are a very big success story. A city like Bilbao must look at Quebec and say, well, why can't we be more like Quebec? That would be a very logical thing. They also have an ancient medieval city, which they have not really marketed. So again, they've marketed the Bilbao around the Guggenheim. They're opening up a new creative industry area, and then they have their old city. Now, Boston is, I think many of you will probably know Boston, have been there. They've really had a big spike in tourism, and I'm not going to read the statistics, but you see them there. It is a very densely populated city. White climate variances, so I think you know about that. And gentrification is obviously something that threatens the historic fabric of the city. Strengths, they've really gone big on contemporary culture. This is Diller and Scafidio's building for their contemporary CCA. They have a big signature sporting event, a huge American story with the American Revolution. They are a soft power destination. Abolitionism is there, the whole story of educating African Americans and educating slaves. That's a very big part of it. The Boston Tea Party, as opposed to subsequent Tea Party, being a soft power. Well, I suppose the subsequent Tea Party, let's not go there. Waterfront, very sought after cruise port, more than 60 museums, 60, and 55 universities. So, when I think there's some evidence, and they've invested heavily in these institutions, and I think that there's some evidence that that this has elevated them as an international tourism destination. Lyon, 6 million, 20% international, and remember, you have a higher percentage of international visitors. Proximity to the United States helps Quebec City for sure. I think it's still impressive. Lyon is, remember, smaller than Quebec City, and I guess it's now climbed its way really impressively to be classed, and the French classify everything, thanks to Diderot. They have been classed as France's #1 city for culture after Paris. But that's still pretty good, I don't think. And they're Europe's #1 destination for a city break. And now those city breaks, of course, are very much based on the low-cost airlines that take you to low-cost airports. And that, I realize that's an issue as big as the question of Confederation itself in our country. So, but I guess when you look at those numbers for Lyon, those of you who have been there will know the convenience of getting there because of the low-cost airlines is really pretty fantastic. And challenge, still a low profile, relatively speaking. I would say, relatively speaking, and the strengths are enormous. Gastronomy, food, and more food. Artistic culture is fairly strong, not as strong. I mean, I don't think that they have, please correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think they have like a really major contemporary museum or historic museum. The French really do keep their main collections in Paris wherever possible. unless there's a kind of revolutionary demand to take them out of Paris. But their biennial is very strong. And again, that I know you've had a curator from Lyon for one. Oh, from Paris. But I think when I looked at the old, no? Okay. I would say that a link with Lyon on your biennial probably could probably be a smart move. This is a way of elevating it. I'm not sure. It's not for me to say what that link would be, but knowing the Whitney as I do, I mean, you should approach the Whitney too, frankly. Like, why not? So I'm not going to read all the things, but again, member of UNESCO Creative City, and they chose to join as media arts. And you're not going to be surprised that one of my big recommendations is that Quebec should join that. I think you would benefit tremendously from it. New Orleans, I have to say New Orleans, huge number of visitors, very low international visitors, but it's growing. They have added a warehouse district, so it's not just historic New Orleans, but there's also a kind of more contemporary cultural warehouse district. So again, trying to broaden the offer, which I think is something that you need to do here in Quebec City. Challenge, not to put too fine a point on it, pretty bad, poverty, history of segregation, and natural disasters recently. So but nonetheless, 9 million visitors in a city of this size is fantastic. And strengths, music, historic district, gastronomy, unique Cajun culture, which obviously has very big links to here, historically an iconic star. Fun and welcoming. Fun factor, when you start to look at the numbers in New Orleans, and the numbers in Dublin, you see that fun is very, very important. And often I'm so, earnest about culture and meaning and all those things that I don't come across as appreciating fun enough. And our sector maybe doesn't anyway. And I think that probably Quebec City with the Carnival, it's in the winter, your fantastic summer festival, remember the importance of fun. Fun boosts the international numbers hugely. And, of course, the iconic event is Mardi Gras. Dublin, of course, it's St. Patrick's Day. And the idea is this is not a city with events. This is an eventful city. There are events, spontaneous events happening all the time. And that's part of the fun picture. And I think it's hard to replicate, but if there was a place that might want to do it, it probably would be here. So, Glasgow. They missed their target of 4 million visitors. They only have 2 million. But their international tourism is growing, and they have a hefty percentage of international visitors, and they haven't separated yet, so those international visitors do not include people from England, right? So when we say, so if you think about that island and you think about its location, 42% of the 2.2 million being international is actually pretty interesting. And Glasgow has had a strategy, industry declined starting after the Second World War, and they've had a strategy of boosting the creative economy, starting with 1990 and being European City of Culture, something that Barry and I worked on. They, in 1999, followed that up by becoming the UK City of Architecture and Design. You compete for these things. And again, unfortunately, hitherto Canada hasn't been as competitive as it should be in that. They are a member of the UNESCO Creative City Network, and they joined for music. Again, authenticity. Well, the Glasgow accent, you could cut it with a knife. It's really unique, and you could actually say that it is also, they have a very humorous and welcoming people as well. So I think that these are strengths that they have managed to package very, very well, but they also have they have challenges. I mean, on that island, it's very hard for any city to compete successfully with Edinburgh and London. Geneva, I'm not going to read these out to you, but you can see that of course, it's a very international city. They have a challenge. I like this picture. It's so great, of a bureaucratic image. Having said that, though, they have a beautiful historic city. They do reflect in the bureaucracies that they host tremendous soft power. They have the Red Cross Museum. They have the UN Center for Immigration and Migration, and they're really trying to project more of a soft power image in the world and become a place for study. Relatively small, but interesting. Dublin, well, it's unbelievable. 75% are international visitors. International tourism is growing at 20% a year. I mean, even if these numbers were off by 50%, they're still astonishing. But I can't see why they would be. And they had about 6 million in 2015. Well, really, we'd rounded to 7 million, technically speaking. And I think there is a lot to learn. It is a hard-to-reach location, but I think that they do very, very well with these low-cost airlines and being, a weekend break. And strengths, music and literary scene. Very, very, very extensive. Bars, pubs, informal. You don't have to always buy a ticket for everything. And they market it successfully. Linked to Celtic culture. There it is again. Remember, and I didn't start out thinking this. It just, we just amassed, it just happened that these little success stories, member of UNESCO Creative City Network for Literature. Fun factor, huge. Big success factor is fun. A big iconic event. We talked about diaspora because of poverty and a huge Irish diaspora, which really feeds international tourism tremendously. And I know that there's an initiative here to reach out to the Francophone diaspora of North America, which I think is like an absolutely genius idea that your tourism department has initiated, because there are cities and towns throughout Canada and the United States that were founded by, inhabited by people who essentially came from Quebec. And that reaching out to the diaspora is a very definite success factor. And I think that Dublin, in a way, proves that. And it would be Quebec City that would be the beneficiary of that strategy, which I think is fantastic, and I congratulate you on it. And then they have clusters, many, many different neighborhoods, although it's a small city. So we're nearing the end. I don't know how we're doing for time.
15 minutes.
Okay, so we're going to skip right. Okay, so we're going to skip Reykjavik. It's one thing I would say that what's fascinating, though, is what its strengths are. Just to remember, you do have a fantastic environment in which you're situated. The volcanic eruption of 2010 was a benefit. Nobody had even heard of Reykjavik until then, and then suddenly it was in the middle of all our lives. Unique culture and language. We're doing a museum there, so we're kind of excited about that. And here it is again. It's a member of the UNESCO Creative City Network for Literature. Very important sagas. The big Icelandic saga, very significant, and of course their language. So you see the picture of the cities in which you might consider yourself a tier. Language, right? Unique identity, creative, kind of a creative culture. They all seem to fit together. So what do we learn from these successes? I'm not going to read them. You can read them faster, but these are the same points I made before. I think that you, as a city, a Quebec city, could do somewhat better in probably not in authenticity, but certainly in the way you cluster and conceive of the clusters. You definitely should focus more on relevance and in the meta-narrative. You need to link up what you do with the international places, so that your awareness, so that when a newspaper journalist writes about something that's happening in Lyon, they refer to your biennial as well. You see, that's the kind of connections you have to make. Diaspora, I think, is powerful, and you're already doing it. As I say, it's very hard to give you guys any advice whatsoever. The UNESCO Creative Cities Network, I would urge you to apply for. And again, whatever you can do to increase airline access will pay dividends even in a more environmentally friendly future. So that's what the Creative Cities Network looks like. And you can see along the bottom what the different, where is this place where this balloon is? Sort of in the middle of Quebec. I don't know. But anyway. I don't know. I don't know. But we know it's Montreal, and yet there isn't. Yeah, probably it's a European map, and they didn't know where Montreal was, so they put it there. That's probably what happened, because we took this from the UNESCO website. But you can see the choices that you would have of all, you can't do design, because Montreal has design, but you could do the others, so one of the others. So that's just something to think about. Virtual networks, very important. You are to be congratulated because you have free Wi-Fi in the city, and that's fantastic. And one suggestion to consider is that you make the access point a splash page that actually uses as an advertising vehicle at the same time. That would be an improvement you could make. And the content of putting things on the web, the important thing is to be able to use it, not just to have it sitting there like collection online. And there was a wonderful example of that today. Is there anybody here from the Musée de la Civilisation? Oh, I have to give you the biggest compliment. There was a great piece about you on a website that I follow, which is hypoallergic. Yeah, they featured this thing where you can pair your face with a 2,000-year-old statue from Geneva, and very, very nice coverage. But above all, it's not about that coverage. It's about the example of it's a great way to make a collection, even though it's somebody else, or it is somebody else's collection, relevant to you, the person. And I thought that was great. So you can find it online. So digital initiatives, always think about networking, network with cities like your Francophone, Francophile cities, network, link. The more gateways you can create, the more your international success will be. Meta-narrative, talked about that quite a lot. And I guess I would just put out there that you live so many, you in Quebec, so many of the world's prominent narratives, well, language being one, and this is a fantastic museum of the Portuguese language in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I never understood why there wasn't a museum of language in Quebec, so I just put it out there because, again, or a major exhibition, because that's highly relevant. And this is just another, this is a photograph that I took, and I just like it a lot. It's a piece by Yoko Ono in the Tolerance Museum in Mexico City, where people can hang their wishes, and it's traveled around a bit. But again, it's a lovely example of placemaking and putting meaning into public realm. So what is the meta-narrative for Quebec City? I think that's your choice and your decision. My recommendation would be move beyond the current concept that it's a collection of things to see, but you're part of a big world story. You always have been. You always have been. And that's very important as part of utilizing your cultural assets, particularly the art and the theater and the creative industries, in order to reach that next international level of your tourism. And so that concludes my remarks. And I look forward to your questions. Oh, good. Okay, great.
Well, I'd like to, of course, thank Gail. Is there some of you that want to stay for some questions? Yes? I think it's a lot of challenges that have been put forward to us. Donc, beaucoup de défis qui sont mentionnés ici. En même temps, je pense qu'on se positionne extrêmement bien. Donc, on a des gens du Festival d'été, on a des gens du Carrefour de théâtre, on a Rhonda qui est là aussi de la Ville de Québec. Je ne sais pas qui a envie de se lancer, notre collègue de la SDC, dans cette discussion. On pouvait commencer en français, hein, si vous voulez, il n'y a aucun problème. Donc, est-ce qu'il y a quelque chose de particulier qui vous a frappé? Oui, Rhonda.
I'll break the ice.
Oh, so nice of you. Thanks.
Well, I just wanted to say, I have like a little secret for you. We are applying this year for a creative city, cultural city at UNESCO. So it's already on. It's almost. I think we're going to hand in our dossier in about 2 weeks. So we're already on that. Alors, ce que je disais, c'est que c'est un peu un secret, là, mais on est déjà en train de... Là, ça n'est plus un. On est en train de déposer une candidature pour devenir ville créative à l'UNESCO. Alors, mais ça va être ça mon secret. Mais we know how important it is. And we really want to be part of it. So, yeah. So you see, we're networking, but but I do have a question. Clusters. How do you manage to sell a cluster, but where everybody has like equal opportunity to, you know, when you're promoting? How do you promote a cluster? And it's fair share for everybody in the cluster.
Okay, that's oh, okay, great. Oh, okay. I think that's an interesting question. I don't know that fairness is really part of it, to be frank with you. I think that the idea is to recognize that it's a cluster, to get everybody together, to, if you like, have a mini meta-narrative around what this area of the city or is all about, and to make sure it's referenced as a group. Usually, there would be a major anchor. I don't know that everybody is equal anyway. But the small benefit from the big, and the big really benefit from the vitality of the small. Because for any one big attraction, there'll always be somebody in the social group or who would prefer to do something else. So I think maybe don't worry about the fairness, or explain that.
Well, I'm not worried, but I wanted that message to pass.
Okay, good. Oh, so there's another secret in the room, is there? Okay, good. Yeah, okay.
Oui, au fond derrière, s'il vous plaît. Merci. Il y a un micro qui arrive.
Hi, I'm Grant Hamilton. I live here in Quebec City, but I'm originally from Toronto. And I'd like to talk about the distinction between American tourists in Quebec City and tourists from other parts of Canada. My hypothesis is that we should be treating the other provinces like international tourists, not for any political reason, but because domestic tourists, Quebecers, they come to Quebec because they have family obligations here, and they know people here, and they have business to do here. But, you know, when I announced when I was 32 that I was moving to Quebec City in Toronto, people were astounded. It was like I was going to a foreign country. They don't know anybody who lives here. And so for them to come here, it's a cultural trip. And it's also a very desirable trip. And I have a feeling that the only difference between American and Canadian tourists here is that the Canadian figures are sort of altered by the fact that there are so many school groups that come.
Right. Well, I think that, and probably people from tourism, and Andre could speak to this, I think that there does need to be a more refined analysis than what I could do for this little talk of the numbers and what they mean, you know, and looking at the demographics and the psychographics of the Canadians versus the Americans versus the Europeans. I mean, this is a very important business, and so that should be looked at carefully. From the economist's point of view, if you're spending Canadian dollars, you're spending Canadian dollars, and that would be true in Scotland as well. But I think you're making a good point that there's a cultural dimension that maybe you have to look at differently. So I think there's maybe multiple ways of looking at these numbers. And I don't think it qualifies as big data, but more sophisticated data than what I presented.
Thank you, Gail. Is there any other questions? Yes. Just.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was very interesting. You've talked about a lot of things that cities could do to strive to be better, but for you, also I'm seeing the 10 places to visit that we shouldn't do. So I think there's a lot on storytelling and the way we present ourselves. If we had like our 12 things to do to work towards having a good storytelling here in Quebec City, where would you start? Because there's a lot about language, what you've said. There's a lot about being UNESCO, but because there's so many forces and people here and stakeholders at play, it's hard sometimes to manage. And for André, maybe it'll be a tough job, but I'm curious about it.
I think that that's the project.
Good answer.
I did think about it, but I think that that is the project. And so maybe you would hold the question and then initiate a project. Nothing is impossible in that sense. I guess my meta-narrative idea was inspired by Robert Lepage. He has to be one of the world's greatest practitioners of the meta-narrative, and here he is right here. I'm not saying turn it over to him, but I think it's kind of in the DNA of this place to be able to figure it out. That's what I'd say.
Merci, Yann. D'autres questions? Alors, on est conscient qu'il se fait un peu tard. Oui. Attends, tu peux prendre le micro, ma chère.
Thanks. It was very interesting.
Festival
What do you
d'été.
think, or do you have an opinion, maybe you don't, about that new, let's call it branding for Quebec City called l'Accent d'Amérique? Have you heard about it?
Oh, actually, no. Maybe why don't you tell me about it? Tell us all about it.
It's the city who decided to have, do you call it a branding? Sure, a branding, and everywhere where you see the logo of the city of Quebec, you see that sentence, that tagline. It's l'accent d'Amérique, America's accent. It refers to, of course, to our French language, so it refers a lot to what you've been saying about language.
Well, I think that I can't really have an opinion about that, although on the face of it, I don't know. How do local people feel about it, by the way?
It's hard to say. Why? You want me to tell you?
Yeah,
because
I do.
It's not, because I think it's not that well known in Quebec City.
Yeah.
But there's work to do on it, and it's okay. It's kind
so-
of a new branding.
All right. So what I think is
so
I'll tell you my opinion. Not so much. I mean, to me, it doesn't sound great, but but that's neither here nor there. I think the problem is that without a meta-narrative, you become a kind of prey to logo-type branding. It's so easy. It's not hard anyway. To come up with clever statements or think again and double take. But what is it relating to? It's relating to this enormous complexity, as this person said, of Quebec City, and ultimately as the birthplace of this extraordinary culture and national identity and everything else. So I think that the meta-narrative is a way of helping ground that necessary logo brand making process. All right. So every time you do need to refresh the brand. You do, because you're out there selling, you're out there marketing, your people are having to go to these trade shows and tourism shows, and you have to have something new to present every year, and it's a lot of pressure. But what's it at? And it's usually based on certain fairly restrictive market research. So I think that's why I come back to this meta-narrative ideas. I think it's important to have a big story that's your story for 5 or 6 years. And then the brand change is not such a big deal.
Merci, Lucie.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating.
Sorry.
For the last over 30 years, I've been giving talks to groups arriving here from Harvard, Stanford, boards of directors, and so on, to Americans, to French, from people from Britain. And We have a mega narrative. We have an unbelievable narrative, and that is, this was the capital of New France, which stretched down to the Gulf of Mexico, then the capital of British North America. The great powers fought over it. It has an extraordinary link with the American Revolution. When Americans discover their own history when they come here, it blows them away. So there's a huge story, but it's just not told that much. And maybe people underestimate it because it's their own history that they're used to living in and don't realize how significant it can be to others. But in Quebec City, our history, if you're British, if you're French, if you're American, if you're Canadian, it's your history. Because there are very unexpected and dramatic stories linked to the peoples, all of those peoples, that they can discover when they come here. And then you have this rich mixture of English, French, and American influences that authentically come together here because of this rich history. So it's an extraordinary story, which constantly inspires and fascinates people from around the world if it's told.
Yeah, I think you've touched on something that I think what you've just said. If we were all sitting in Boston right now, nobody would ever need to say that, because Americans feel that way about themselves. Yeah. But we as Canadians, Quebecois, Ontarians, we're a deeply colonized society, each in our own different compartments. That's not even getting into the indigenous story and the story of escaped slaves and freedom and all those things. So yeah, that's why it's a project. That's why it's a project. And then how to link it, and I don't think it's all that difficult, really. But but what's hard is overcoming our colonialism to do it. That's what's hard. And it's even maybe painful. And yes, I was just going to say, and then how to link it to the present highly technological, creative society that also Quebec is. I mean, as an Ontarian, I'm very, very aware, and especially in my line of work, that if we're looking for creativity in exhibit design, logo, graphics, we're going to find much more here in Quebec as a province, Montreal, Quebec City, than we would anywhere else. So I think it speaks to the need for a kind of joined-up story, to use a British term, yes.
And one could say that the part of the source of that creativity is that cultural mix, which is a surprising cultural mix. French-speaking people in North America, etc.
Yeah. Merci beaucoup. Alors, écoutez, je pense que le temps file. Est-ce qu'il y a, à moins qu'il y ait vraiment une autre question, je conclurai en remerciant très chaleureusement Gail et bien sûr tous nos participants. Et est-ce que Rhonda a envie de faire le petit mot de la fin? Parce que je pense qu'André a quitté Rhonda. Est-ce que je me trompe? Alors, il y a un micro juste à côté.
Gail, on behalf of all of us here and the city and the museum, we want to thank you sincerely. It was a privilege. It was very interesting. We learned a lot. We know we still have a lot of work to do. Alors, merci beaucoup. Ça a été très enrichissant. Je cherche toujours à traduire le soft power. Là, je suis rendue dans ma tête à influence douce, mais c'est pas bon. Alors, merci mille fois. Ça a été un plaisir de vous avoir, un honneur, un privilège, et j'espère qu'on pourra vous accueillir bientôt à nouveau à Québec. So, thank you sincerely.